audacious strategies, paddock arguments, and papaya wins. This week I'm chatting all about the Bahrain Grand Prix. So get ready, because you've been summoned to the Steward's office. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Steward's office. I'm Syra, and this week Formula 1 headed out to Bahrain for the Bahrain Grand Prix. And yes, it was a little later than we normally have this GP. Normally it is the season opener, it has been for the past couple of years, but because of Ramadan they had to push this GP down the calendar a little bit. But it was a race that I was excited for us to go out to because the last few races have not been the most exciting, and Japan in particular. I said it during my last episode, it just didn't have that much excitement during the race. But I had a good feeling about Bahrain because the drivers know this circuit so well, even the rookie drivers who've been in F2 coming up. And it's also a circuit that these specific cars are going to be really used to because all of the preseason testing was done out there, so the teams should be a little bit more confident in how the cars are going to behave. And it is a circuit I do quite like us going to. I love a night race and everything, so I was excited for Bahrain, and I'm gonna say it right now, I was so happy with the race. It was actually exciting to watch, way more exciting than Suzuka, which was a bit of a letdown. Bahrain gave us some close racing, some really good overtakes, and we do have a lot to chat about this week. But before I get into that, as usual, let's have a bit of a chat about some of the news that happened before the race weekend even started. And there's really only one piece of news that I want to talk about that a lot of people were talking about online, and that is what has been going on with the FIA. Now, I think this news came out on Thursday, which was media day for the Bahrain Grand Prix. It was definitely towards the end of this race week before the cars got on track. We had news that Robert Reid, who is the vice president for sporting in the FIA, had stepped down from his role with immediate effect. No notice given, nothing like that. He handed in his resignation and he left his role. And he put out a super lengthy statement, but a statement where it was very telling about his feelings towards the FIA and why he was leaving. He didn't try and cover this up at all. Now, he basically said that when he had started with the FIA, when he had taken on his role as vice president of sport, he did it because he wanted to serve the members of the FIA, and instead it felt like he was serving power. He said that there was a fundamental breakdown of the governance of the FIA, and he also said that critical decisions were being made without due process, which for a governing body like the FIA, who oversee a lot of different motorsport series, I talk about F1 on here, but they cover so many different motorsport series from junior categories all the way up to Formula 1 and WEC and Formula E. That is worrying if they are making these decisions without going through the proper processes that are put in place for a reason. And I think for me, the most telling part of that statement was the fact that he said that he felt like he was basically serving power instead of people, because the head of the FIA right now is Mohammed Ben Sulayem, and let's be honest, there's been a lot of unhappiness about his tenure as FIA president, and I think a lot of people have felt like there's been more power at play than actually looking after the FIA members and the FIA series. So that was a really telling part of the statement for me. And look, we are at a point where the public and the FIA members are losing some of their trust and faith in the FIA. And that's never a good sign for a governing body, right? Let alone the FIA, who have become a lot more public. And I think especially since Liberty Media came into Formula 1 and we've had Drive to Survive come up, right? A lot more people are looking at the governance of these sports and not just Formula 1, all of their different series. It's drawn more attention to them, and a lot of fans are unhappy, but also critically, a lot of the drivers and the team members of all the different teams within their motorsport series, they're not happy with the decisions that are being made. So I don't think this is going to necessarily instill any hope or any more faith and trust into the FIA. A decision like this was such a big part part of the FIA opting to leave with no resignation and doing that with immediate effect. So that is what's going on with the FIA at the moment. Members that aren't particularly happy, and obviously people who are working within the FIA not being particularly happy and opting to walk. So I'll be interested to see what goes on there as this season goes on. But going on to the on-track action, I'm going to dive straight into qualifying because there is a lot that went on during qualifying and the race that we need to have a chat about. Looking at Q1, I mean, the most gutting thing for me was seeing Ollie Behrman in P20. He didn't manage to get out of Q1 and is going to be starting at the back of the grid. So I was gutted for him because he was doing quite well. But also out in Q1 was Alex Albon, which was a little bit shocking, but he didn't make it out of Q1, and Carlos Sainz had managed to actually out-qualify him for the first time this season. I'm going to chat about that Alex Albon exit in Q1 a little bit more because there is something that definitely annoyed me and Williams and Alex and James Vowles and a lot of F1 fans, is the fact that Alex should have made it into Q2. He should not have been kicked out in Q1 because we found out after Q2 was done that Nico Hülkenberg had his Q1 lap time deleted, which meant that he wouldn't have made it through into Q2, and that would have bumped Alex Albon into Q2. Usually, right, the FIA are really good at calling up track limit violations, especially in qualifying, because it's really critical that you get those violations right during qualifying, more so than the race, right, in my opinion, because in the race you can do the post-race penalties and it's fine, but in qualifying you are risking having someone like Alex Albon not move on to the next stage of qualifying because you haven't called up a track violation correctly. And that's what happened here, and I know James Vowles was not happy with this, and it's just disappointing. I don't know what happened and why they weren't keeping an eye. The FIA had opted to widen one of the white lines at the track, so obviously there was less of a margin for error, and you would think that they would then be looking at all of these things and be looking at track limits, like I said, especially in qualifying, but they didn't. So Nico Hülkenberg did go out in Q2 and he did his runs and then found out that it didn't even matter because he didn't technically make it out of Q1, and Alex Albon was robbed of a shot to get a higher place on the grid, which is absolutely gutting. Did have a little bit of drama in Q2 because Esteban Ocon ended up crashing his Haas right at the start. It was his first fast lap and it caused a red flag. Obviously, they needed to get that car off track and make sure Esteban Ocon was okay. The medical car did come and pick him up. Did kind of ruin the run plans for some other drivers because tyre deg was insane at Bahrain and those soft tyres were not holding on when they were doing their fast laps. So for the drivers who were already on a fast lap when that red flag went out, they were at a little bit of a disadvantage because of that. I tell you what though, Jack Doohan had a particularly good qualifying session, I think, coming off the back of a couple of bad weeks. He made it into Q2, set some good times, and just looked a lot more comfortable here, I found. So that was good news for him and for Alpine. But when we got to Q3, I don't think it's necessarily going to surprise many people that it was a McLaren on pole position, and it was Oscar Piastri who put in an amazing lap for pole. What might surprise people, and what did surprise me, was the fact that Lando Norris wasn't starting next to him or even in the second row, because Lando Norris had qualified in P6. I don't know what happened, but I think it was just a very cautious lap for everyone with lap times getting deleted, and Lando couldn't pull that lap together, which the McLaren was capable of, and ended up qualifying quite far down, and the lowest that he's qualified in a little while actually. So a bit of a disappointing qualifying for Lando Norris' side of the garage, but for Oscar Piastri, a really amazing result from them. Now George Russell was going to be starting next to Oscar Piastri on the grid, but ended up getting a one-place grid penalty along with his teammate Kimi Antonelli because during the red flag, those two cars had come out into the pit lane a little bit too early before they were allowed to, and therefore had to serve a grid place penalty. So it was Charles Leclerc sitting next to Oscar Piastri on the grid, and it looked like the Ferrari was doing a little better. They'd come in with a lot of upgrades this weekend, and it did seem like they were working, not on par with the McLaren by any means, but better than it has been. But where was Max Verstappen, I hear you ask? Where did he go and what happened? Because I have yet to mention him. Max and Red Bull and Yuki Tsunoda had a messy qualifying. It was bad. They'd had lap times deleted for track limits. They had both of their drivers really struggling. Both of them got into Q3, but it wasn't a clean qualifying for them. Max ended up qualifying in P7. A really rough qualifying for him to not even be in the top 5. The Red Bull was just not great. He was complaining about braking, and I don't think it was going much better for Yuki either. So they both got into the top 10, but I think considering the heroics we saw from Max in Japan, this was definitely disappointing. But let's get into the actual race though, what happened on the Sunday, because it was a really good race. There were so many overtakes going on up and down the field, and it just felt like proper F1 because Suzuka felt very processional. There wasn't much change going on. This felt a bit more interesting to me, and some of the battles and overtakes we got was so exciting to watch. So let's delve into what was going on at the top of the field with some of our title contenders. And because we finished off with Max Verstappen in quali, I am gonna continue with him during the race. And it wasn't a great race for Max Verstappen by his own standards, right? And I don't blame him. I think he drove that car best he could, but that car did not want to be driven, I think is the best way for me to put it. It was a very difficult car, and we heard a lot of complaints from Max. We heard about overheating. I think he had mentioned the gears or the brakes at one point, and when he did his first pit stop and went onto the hard tyres, he was not happy with them, and he could not get them in that right window that he wanted them. He was slipping and sliding over the track. He didn't have grip and really struggled, in that first part of that hard tyre stint to get them to a place he was happy and get those overtakes in. And that stint probably also didn't help and put him on the back foot a little bit. Now, he ended up finishing in P6, which isn't bad. Once again, he's still in the points, but by Red Bull standards, this isn't great. They want Max to get his 5th championship this year. They want him fighting for it. They want him and Yuki fighting for that WCC. And when the car isn't allowing them to do that, and when they can't put those performances in that we know Max Verstappen can do in a Red Bull car, there's only so much the drivers can do. So a really disappointing race for Max, and he wasn't happy down the radio because coming into this weekend he was only 1 point away from Lando Norris in the championship, in the drivers' championship, and the hope is always that you're gonna overtake that driver because you're as close as you can get when you're 1 point away. So the hope is for a lot of Max Verstappen fans that he would have been able to overtake Lando this weekend, or at least make sure the gap didn't open up too much. But that gap did open up a little bit more because of that points deficit and the car just not being in a great window. Lando Norris, though, does continue to lead the Drivers' Championship, and he ended up in P3. To podium after not having a great qualifying is definitely a good sign. That P3, though, I think could have potentially become P2. But he ended up having to serve that 5-second time penalty for being outside of his grid box. And look, I think he did a great job at making up those 5 seconds, but I think it obviously did affect the race somewhat for him. I'm not saying it had a massive effect, but you just don't know what would have happened without that 5-second time penalty when he had to stay in his pit box for a little bit longer. It meant that there were more cars that he had to overtake, more time that he was stationary and losing places, and it does have an effect. So it's a case of what could have been. Do I think he could have matched the race winner's pace, which was Oscar Piastri's teammate? Potentially, if it hadn't been for that 5-second time penalty, but still a really good P3 for Lando Norris, who, like I said, is still leading the Drivers' Championship, so not a bad weekend for him by any means. Which brings me on to our race winner, Oscar Piastri. Now, he is currently in P2 in the championship. He's overtaken Max Verstappen with his win out in Bahrain. And this is the first time that McLaren have won out in Bahrain, which is insane to me. This race has been going on since 2004. And it's the first time that they've won there. And for them, they say it's like their second home race because part of McLaren is owned by Bahrain and the Crown Prince. There's a lot of sort of involvement in McLaren, and they were there for the photo shoot at the end of last season in Abu Dhabi, so they have a lot of links to Bahrain, and it was the first time that they've managed to win that Grand Prix, their second home race, and it didn't look in doubt for Oscar. He pulled a really good gap to George Russell. It was at least 2 seconds throughout the race, and they didn't really show Oscar Piastri on the Sky F1 stream at all. They didn't even show him crossing the line. It was on like the little sort of side camera in the timing tower, which I am gutted about because I love seeing when whoever it is wins cross the line. I love seeing them celebrate and their team being there to celebrate with them. So that was a bit gutting and wasn't great with the TV direction, but that's just me. Some people might have preferred not to have seen him cross the line. I don't know. But it is something that I like seeing regardless, though. That didn't take away from the fact that Oscar Piastri is our first multiple race winner of the season. So he's on really good form at the moment. And I think a lot of people are backing Lando Norris to take home the WDC. But I think Oscar Piastri could mount a really good challenge. And between those two McLaren drivers, I genuinely think it could be either of them. Also, a quick chat about George Russell, who was running in podium positions and then took home P2. He had a fantastic race, considering that the Mercedes car was essentially falling apart on him. The transponder wasn't working properly, so if you were watching the live timings on the app, you had no clue where he was or what the gap was or anything. The DRS wasn't working for him. I think at one point his mirrors had fallen off, the brakes weren't working properly. I mean, that Mercedes was hanging on by a thread by the end of the race, but managed to finish in P2, and it was a brilliant drive from him. Let's move on though to all of the midfield battles and our underdogs during this race, and I'm gonna kick off with chatting about Ollie Behrman because this driver went from P20 right at the back of the grid to P10 and scoring a point for Haas, and it was a magnificent drive from him. His overtakes were amazing, and yeah, to get in the points from being at the back of the field was so good. And that wasn't the only piece of good news for Haas, because Esteban Ocon bounced back from that crash in Q2 and got into P8. So a really good race for Haas, a track that the car seems to really like, and both of the drivers doing extremely well to bring home double points. They seem to be working really well together in that team, and they're seeming to mesh well with the team as well, which is really good to see. So hopefully that'll continue for them. Also for Alpine, they've managed to score their very first points of the season. I don't know what happened to Alpine, right? Because they've scored no points in the last couple of races, and then we come out to Bahrain and you've got Pierre Gasly qualifying in P5. I don't know if it's circuit specific or whether they figured out setup or what it is, right? Do I think that form will carry on? I'm going to say no for now. There is a good chance that it might. It does feel a little bit more circuit specific for them right now, but that doesn't take away from the fact that Pierre Gasly qualified in P5 and then finished in P6. It was a really good result for them. And I mean, you've got to give it to Pierre Gasly. He managed to hang on to the back of Charles Leclerc's Ferrari for a lot of the race, right? I'm just really curious where the sudden turn in pace came from them. But talking about Charles and Ferrari, I don't know whether I should have put Ferrari in this midfield section, but I have for now, okay? I have for now, and they actually came home with a really good set of points for the team. Charles Leclerc finishing in P4, Lewis Hamilton going from P9 up to P5. Points that Ferrari really needed. Now, they're still in 4th place in the championship, but like I mentioned before, they came in with a big upgrade package, a new floor and everything, and it seems to be working. I think Charles was saying, look, it's baby steps and we need multiple baby steps to catch up with McLaren, but it is still a step forward. And I think he was also saying, look, these upgrades might not particularly suit Bahrain, but Jeddah might be better. Lewis Hamilton saying that he thinks he understands how the Ferrari wants to be driven a bit more because it's a bit different from his driving style that he had with Mercedes. So he's hoping to apply that next weekend as well. So I'm cautiously saying that things are looking up for Ferrari, and I'm really, really cautiously saying that because I know sometimes I say these things with Ferrari and then it doesn't materialize. Cautiously optimistic that they know what they're doing and how to fix the problems they've been having since the beginning of season. I'm going to leave that there now. We're not talking about it anymore. We're just leaving it there. There was a little bit of drama that went on after the race, apparently at least, but before we get into that drama, let's chat about all of the drama with penalties that happened, because Bahrain gave us quite a few penalties. Let's start off with the fact, right? First of all, we had a safety car, and that came off the back of the fact that Carlos Sainz and Yuki Tsunoda ended up having an incident that caused a lot of debris to come onto the track. I say a lot, I don't think it was loads and loads, but enough that it was on track, and obviously the stewards were worried about it. Now, the incident itself wasn't a problem. The stewards investigated it but found that no one was at fault, but they did opt to call out a full safety car, and a lot of people question the use of that safety car because there's been debris in previous races and things that people thought would warrant a safety car, but it ended up being a VSC or just the yellow flag. So a lot of people questioned whether or not it was needed, because for some of the drivers it did ruin their races a little bit or made it a bit harder for them. A lot of people ended up pitting during that safety car. It was a free pit stop. They were going to have to do a second stop anyway. Some drivers had just pitted or were looking to maybe try and extend as much as they could. So it did ruin a couple of races. I think Alex Albon was someone that mentioned it didn't help him. But aside from the drivers saying that, yeah, it could have ruined their races, I think just in general, people were wondering if it was needed. So it might have ruined some drivers' races, and it might not have been needed, but it did happen. And at that race restart, Liam Lawson ended up having a collision with Lance Stroll, and he got given a 5-second time penalty for it. Later on in the race, he then got a 10-second time penalty for causing an incident with Nico Hülkenberg, so 15 seconds in total. Not great. I mean, he wasn't in the points anyway, but still not great to see. Carlos Sainz got a 10-second time penalty for forcing Kimi Antonelli off track, and by lap 46, I think it was, he ended up having to retire from the race because that incident with Yuki had caused a hole in his side pod. You could see the radiator. It was too much damage, and Williams had opted to retire him, which I think was a sensible decision there. We also had a 5-second time penalty for Jack Doohan because of track limits. He'd gone over way too many times. And then finally, in terms of penalties, we had another disqualification. This time, thankfully, it was not Ferrari. It was Nico Hülkenberg in the kick Sauber. His skid block was under the minimum requirement and became our 4th disqualification of the year. We've only had 4 races, guys, and we have had 4 disqualifications. We are averaging 1 DSQ per race weekend. I really hope that is not something that continues, because that is not a great stat. But yeah, Nico Hülkenberg was disqualified, and that ends our penalties for the Bahrain Grand Prix. But I did say there was a little bit of apparent drama that happened outside of the race, and things don't seem too great at Red Bull right now. Like I mentioned, Bahrain was a tough race for the team, but, right, wasn't terrible because, first of all, Yuki and Max managed to finish the race, and second of all, Yuki and Max managed to get into Q3 and managed to score points. So it wasn't awful, it wasn't terrible. You know, the drivers hadn't been disqualified because of the car, they hadn't, you know, DNF'd or anything like that. It wasn't awful worst case scenario for them, but Red Bull are not happy. And I do understand why, right? Because everyone enters Formula One, all these teams and drivers enter wanting to win. And for Red Bull, who have come off the back of so many years of dominance, who, like I mentioned, are looking at Max Verstappen getting his 5th World Championship, this isn't a good showing for them. This isn't helping Max get his fifth, helping Red Bull get another WCC. And I think what stings for them the most right now is the fact that they had that pole position and win in Suzuka, which was amazing to watch for Max. But then we come to Bahrain and that car seems undrivable and isn't behaving the way that anyone seems to be expecting. Now, it was Marco Horner Weish, I think that's how you pronounce his name, sorry, who is the technical director, and then their chief engineer, Monaghan, who apparently had very heated arguments in the paddock after the race, and apparently it's Weish's job that might be on the line if things aren't sorted out. Like I said, Red Bull just want results. They want a car that their drivers can drive, and they want those results because they're not getting them right now. They can't have these one-offs like Japan where, okay, Max has managed to outdrive the car, get pole position and win. That's not consistency, and it's not a car that either of their drivers are going to be happy with, and it's not going to let them win championships. So that was one argument with sort of management in Red Bull, which I think, let's be honest, you could kind of see it coming with the way Red Bull has been, not just this season, but last season was not brilliant for them either. They seem to be losing their way with the car a little bit there as well. So that's one thing, right? That is a workplace argument going on where, tensions are high between a team, right? Everyone in a team working towards the same goal. But apparently there was another argument that went on. And Max Verstappen's manager apparently got into a very heated argument with Helmut Marko before storming off. Now, these are all apparent. They're just stories I've read. I've not personally seen it happen. But yeah, Max's manager does not seem very happy. And that's a driver essentially telling his team that he isn't happy about it, which feels very different. And of course, we always get the rumours of Max going to Mercedes, Max leaving Red Bull. I don't know, guys. I don't know. Max's contract, I think, runs out in 2029, I want to say. So I couldn't tell you what's going to happen with him. And he'll make that decision on whether he stays with the team, moves to a different team, retires, whatever it is, moves to a different type of motorsport. But his management, at the very least, don't seem to be very happy. And if his management isn't happy, you have to imagine Max Verstappen is not happy with what's going on at Red Bull at the moment. Love to be a fly on the wall for those conversations, and very interested to see what happens for them in Jeddah, because I want to know whether the car can improve from what it was in Bahrain or whether it's going to be in that sort of same place where Max can't compete for the front. And I think for Max, the frustration is also going to come from the fact that he has said the car is the problem. They're swapping out the second driver, and he said himself, that's not what we need to be focusing on. Focus on fixing the car, and it doesn't seem to be happening right now. So we'll see where the development direction goes for Red Bull and how Max is during a race weekend as well, and how he reacts to the car and everything. But yeah, things aren't looking too great at Red Bull right now. But before we finish the episode, it's time for my winners and losers of the weekend. Winner number one has to be McLaren, a double podium at what is essentially one of their home races for the first time is incredible. Because on top of that double podium, they are also now in a 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship, which is amazing. They're leading the constructors. It's been a dream for McLaren right now, and I know Lando Norris has been saying, look, the car still is on a knife edge, it's not always perfect, and I think we saw that with his qualifying, but overall, even when those things aren't great, they're still better than a lot of the other teams on the grid, if not all of them. So they are my winners for the weekend. My second winner and my last winner is going to be Haas, in particular Ollie Behrman, for that stellar drive, but to get double points out in Bahrain, really going to lift the team's spirits, especially after a bad qualifying for Ollie and a bad crash for Esteban Ocon in Q2. Was so glad to see them be able to celebrate double point. Time for our losers though, and I am starting off with Red Bull because of basically everything I've said this episode, guys. This was a really rough weekend for the team. Results that they weren't happy with, a car they weren't happy with, a driver who isn't happy. I am chuffed that Yuki has managed to get his first points with Red Bull, got into Q3. I'm really glad for him, but overall for Red Bull, this is not the weekend and not the results that they wanted. Also on that list though is Carlos Sainz. Sainz. Now, I saw a stat on Instagram that said that he has now DNF from 50% of the races in this season so far. And I know we're only 4 races in, but that is not a stat that anyone wants, especially a driver who is new to that team and needs the time, all the time that he can get with that car to understand how it works and how it drives. And he said himself, he needs that time to settle in with the team. But it was a bit of a messy race for him after what was a really good qualifying session and everything. It was a struggle when it came to the race, the incident with Yuki Tsunoda, which wasn't anyone's fault at the end of the day, but then having to retire. Yes, he is on my losers list for this weekend. It was so much more of an interesting race though, guys. Like I've said, it just had so many more overtakes. It was so much more exciting to watch, and I'm hoping, got my fingers crossed, that Jeddah will be the same, but it's not a great track to overtake on. It's great for outright speed, which is why I think McLaren will do very well there. Mercedes will probably be the second best team, and then it'll be between Ferrari and Red Bull, I think, for that third best team, and I can't figure out who will place where. Then again, we might see Pierre Gasly's car sort of push its way up there with Alpine. So I'm not expecting as many overtakes, but I'm hoping it's still a good race. And we'll see, because Ferrari have said that those upgrades might work better in Jeddah. We'll see if Red Bull can fix what's going on there. But it is our last race in a triple header, which has felt longer than a triple header for me, and then we'll be 5 races into this season, which is crazy. So much has gone on though over 5 races. We've had upgrades, disqualifications, penalty points, so much. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens next week and what changes, and if anything changes, in the Drivers' and Constructors' Championship. But thank you guys so much for listening. Please follow me on TikTok and Instagram at stewards_office, where you can find even more motorsport content from me. And I will see you guys next week when you're summoned to the Stewards office.